The wind did not whisper that night. It screamed. It came down from the peaks of the Beartooth Range like something ancient and furious, hammering the walls of the old Callaway Ranch with a force that rattled every window in its frame and sent loose shingles spinning into the dark. The temperature had dropped to 31 below zero before midnight, the coldest night recorded in Timber Creek, Montana, in over 100 years, and the snow was not falling so much as being hurled sideways, a white wall of violence that erased everything beyond arm's reach. Inside the ranch house, a single lamp burned in the kitchen. Its light did not reach far. A woman named Mava Callaway stood at the back door, dressed in a heavy wool coat, black, the same black she had worn every day for 2 years, and held a lantern whose battery was already struggling, its beam cutting weakly through the storm. She was 53 years old. Her face was lean and weathered, etched with the kind of lines that come not from age alone, but from grief held too long and too tightly. Her dark eyes were steady. Her jaw was set. She had learned, in the years since she buried her husband, not to show what was breaking inside her. She did not know why she had come to the door. There had been a sound. She was almost certain. Something beneath the howling of the wind. Something small and desperate. She told herself it was nothing. A branch, a shudder, the house settling under the weight of a century of Montana winters. She told herself to go back to bed. Instead, she pushed the door open and walked into the storm. The lantern flickered. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and turning the moisture on her lips to ice in seconds. She pressed forward into the dark, following a feeling she could not name, her boots punching through the snow crust with every step. 20 feet from the back porch, the lantern caught something, a shape in the snow, small, pale, almost luminous, as though it carried its own faint light. Mava stopped. She blinked against the wind, certain for one disorienting moment that she was seeing things, that the grief and the isolation and the endless Montana dark had finally done what everyone in town had been predicting for 2 years and driven her quietly out of her mind. But the shape moved, a tiny, trembling movement, a head lifting, eyes half open and glassy, catching the failing lantern beam. A foal, newborn or close to it, white as the snow around it, white as bleached bone, white as something that had no business being alive in a storm like this. It was tied to an old metal stake driven into the frozen ground, a stake she recognized, one that had once held a fence post near the old corral, and the rope around its neck was pulled tight, leaving it no room to stand, no room to lift its head more than a few inches from the snow. It had been left there, not lost, not fallen, left. The rope was wound deliberately, knotted in a way that required hands. Human hands. Someone had driven that stake into the frozen earth and tied this creature to it, and walked away and left it to die in the coldest night in a century. The lantern battery gave out. The darkness swallowed everything. Mava stood in the blind black cold with the wind screaming around her, and the question that formed in her mind in that moment was one that would not leave her for weeks. Who in this world hated a lonely widow enough to leave a miracle of nature to freeze to death in her own backyard? And why was the rope tied in a knot her dead husband had taught her to recognize? Before we go any further, something you need to consider. In a moment, you are going to meet a woman who has spent 2 years being told, quietly, and then not so quietly, that she is broken, that she is a burden, that the grief she carries makes her unreliable, unstable, someone to be managed from a careful distance. And then on the coldest night in a century, something arrives in her backyard that her entire town will soon insist she imagined. Here is what I want to ask you. If everyone around you decided your truth was a lie, if the people who were supposed to protect you became the ones most desperate to silence you, what would you do? Think about it. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. And if you have ever stood up for something that cost you everything, leave a fist emoji. You will understand why by the end. If this story already has you leaning forward, hit that like button now and subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because this one is going to stay with you. Now, let me tell you about Mava Callaway and the white foal and the man wearing the badge who should have been ashamed of himself long before any of this began. Timber Creek was not a cruel town, exactly. That was the most honest thing you could say about it. The people who lived there, the ranchers and the mechanics and the women who ran the diner on Elm Street, and the men who gathered at the feed store on Saturday mornings to complain about cattle prices and federal land policy, were not bad people in the way that word usually means. They did not take pleasure in suffering. They did not wake up in the morning looking for someone to hurt. But they were afraid of grief. Afraid the way small communities often become afraid of things they cannot fix or categorize or move past. Grief that lingered past what they considered a reasonable season made them uncomfortable. It reminded them of their own losses, their own fragility, the precariousness of the ordinary lives they had built in the shadow of mountains that did not care whether they lived or died. And Maeva Calloway's grief had lingered for 2 full years. Her husband, Douglas Calloway, had disappeared on the 14th of February, 24 months before the night of the frozen foal. He had ridden out in the early hours of a February storm on his prize stallion, a coal-black thoroughbred named Conductor, to check the condition of his northern fence line. He did this routinely. He was a methodical man, careful, someone who had spent 30 years reading Montana weather and had never once been seriously caught out by it. He did not come back. The search party found him 3 days later, half a mile from his own property line, face down in the snow, frozen solid. The county coroner ruled it hypothermia. A tragic accident. A man who misjudged the temperature, perhaps moved too slowly, perhaps had a moment of confusion in the whiteout conditions that had swept through on that particular afternoon. What the coroner's report did not address, what no official document ever addressed, because no one had pushed hard enough, and Maeva had been too destroyed by shock in those first weeks to push at all, was the absence of the horse. Conductor was never found. A champion stallion worth more than some people's houses, a horse Douglas Calloway had raised from a foal and refused to sell at any price, had simply vanished from the landscape as completely as if the snow had swallowed him whole. Maeva had mentioned this, once to the sheriff, once to the deputy, once to the county assessor when he came to discuss estate matters. Each time, she had been listened to with the particular patience reserved for people who are considered to be in the early stages of not coping well. The sheriff, a man named Garth Plunkett, who had held the position for 11 years and who wore his authority with the easy comfort of someone who had never seriously expected it to be challenged, told her, gently and then less gently, that horses sometimes wandered, that the storm had been severe, that Conductor had likely crossed into one of the higher valleys and frozen somewhere in the wilderness, and that the body would surface when the spring melt came. It never did. 2 years passed. Spring came twice. The valley went green twice and brown twice and white again. No one found Conductor. No one found any trace of the animal that Douglas Calloway had loved more than almost anything in his life except, occasionally, his wife. And Timber Creek quietly, gently, compassionately began to move on without Maeva. This was not a coordinated effort. It was something more organic than that, and in its own way more devastating. The invitations to the church suppers came less frequently and then stopped entirely. The neighbors who had, in the first months after Douglas's death, brought casseroles and firewood and quiet company began to find themselves too busy, too preoccupied, too aware of how Maeva looked at them sometimes with those steady, too perceptive dark eyes, as though she were reading something in their expressions they did not want read. The gossip started as whispers. It always does. People began to say, carefully, kindly, in the way that allows speakers to believe they mean no harm, that Maeva had not been herself since the loss, that the isolation of the ranch was making things worse, that she had been seen talking to herself in the parking lot of the grocery store, that she had accused the feed supply clerk of overcharging her when the receipt was perfectly clear, that she was drinking, perhaps, that she was not sleeping. That grief, if left too long, became something else, something clinical, something requiring intervention. Garth Plunkett had done nothing to discourage these conversations. In fact, if you had sat in the diner on enough Tuesday mornings and listened carefully to the way he let certain things drop in certain company, you might have noticed that he had a talent for steering narratives without appearing to steer anything at all. And so Maeva Calloway had spent 2 years becoming, in the eyes of her community, a woman to be managed rather than believed. She still ran her ranch, stubbornly, alone, refusing the offers of help that came with too many questions attached. She still rode her remaining 2 horses every morning, rain or shine or blizzard. She still stood straight when she walked into town, still looked people in the eye, still answered every passive-aggressive attempt at pity with a politeness so precise it functioned as a wall. But she did not sleep well, and she did not stop thinking about Conductor. On the night the foal arrived, she had been sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, running her thumb over and over a photograph of Douglas taken the summer before he died. He was standing in the sunlight beside Conductor, one hand on the horse's neck, laughing at something outside the frame. He looked permanent. He looked like someone the world was not going to simply misplace. That was when she heard it, beneath the wind, beneath the groaning of the storm. A sound so faint she almost convinced herself it was nothing. Almost. Maeva found the stake by touch more than sight. Her lantern was dead, but she did not go back for another. Something in the sound the foal made when she knelt beside it, a thin, reedy exhalation, barely there, barely anything, told her that going back for anything meant there would be nothing left to go back to. She stripped off her wool coat in 31 below zero and laid it over the animal's shaking body while she worked the knot loose with fingers that lost sensation inside of a minute. The rope was heavy, braided nylon, stiff with ice. She worked by feel, her hands burning and then numb and then nothing. Her teeth clenched against a cold that was trying very specifically and very efficiently to kill her. She recognized the knot. Douglas had taught it to her. A modified bowline with a secondary loop he had developed himself for tethering horses in rough weather. Strong enough to hold a full-grown stallion in high wind, complex enough that it would not slip or loosen under tension. He had called it, with the dry humor that was his primary mode of affection, the Callaway hitch. She had never seen anyone else use it, had never thought to wonder whether anyone else knew it. She did not let herself think about what that meant. Not yet. She cut the rope instead, using the folding knife she had started keeping in her jeans pocket about 18 months ago, for reasons she had never entirely examined. The foal made no movement when the tension released. It lay in the snow with its legs folded beneath it, its white coat plastered wet and gray against its ribs, its breathing so shallow she had to press her palm flat against its side to be sure it was still there. Its eyes were open the width of a fingernail, glassy and unfocused, already beginning the slow inward retreat that Maeva associated with things dying. She picked it up. It weighed less than she expected. It was newborn, or nearly so, cords still attached, umbilical dark and raw, legs that had never learned to carry their own weight. She lifted it like a child, its head falling against her shoulder, its legs dangling, and she walked back through the storm toward the rectangle of kitchen light. The walk felt long. Her arms burned. Her feet could not feel the ground. She talked to the foal the whole way. Not words. Exactly. More sound than words. The kind of low, continuous murmur that was less about language and more about letting something know that it was not alone. She had done it once before, for a calf that had fallen through river ice, and then later, without planning to, she had done it sitting beside Douglas in the hospital the night before he went out to check the fence and never came back. The kitchen was warm. The warmth hit her like a wall. She laid the foal on the linoleum floor, turned the oven on, and opened its door for radiant heat, and began the process of finding out whether it was too late. It nearly was. She boiled water and filled 2 hot water bottles from a cabinet that still held Douglas's emergency supplies, things he had prepared for situations like this, because he was exactly that kind of man. She wrapped the bottles in dish towels and pressed them against the foal's chest and flanks. She stripped the wet coat from its body and began rubbing, slow, firm, deliberate circles along the legs and joints, the way the old rancher who had trained her as a girl had shown her. Hypothermia in a foal was a war fought in inches. You brought the core temperature up before the extremities. You did not rush it. You were patient even when patience felt like watching someone drown. She found a dropper in the cabinet and mixed warm water with honey and a small amount of milk from the refrigerator and began administering it a few drops at a time, tilting the foal's head just enough to encourage swallowing without risking aspiration. It took 40 minutes before it swallowed on its own. She counted each swallow. She counted 47 in the first hour. Around 4 in the morning, she paused long enough to look at what she was working with. The foal was white. Not cream-colored, not pale gray, white. Pure, absolute white, from the tips of its ears to the underside of its hooves. In the kitchen light, it looked almost fabricated, too perfect, too stark against the ordinary world of worn linoleum and cabinet paint. She had never seen a foal like it. True albinos were rare enough in horses to be nearly mythological. The genetic odds against it were enormous, and most that were born carried health complications that shortened their lives. But this one was breathing with increasing steadiness. Its legs, which had been rigid and immovable, were beginning to tremble with something closer to voluntary movement, then hypothermic convulsion. Its eyes, when they opened fully for the first time around 5 in the morning, were pale blue, another marker of the albino trait, and they found Maeva's face with a directness that stopped her completely. She had expected the unfocused gaze of a newborn, the vague and searching quality of eyes that had not yet learned what to do with the world. Instead, the foal looked at her as though it recognized her. She sat back on her heels and pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth, a gesture she used when she needed a moment to gather herself. That was when she saw it. She had been working methodically from nose to tail, clearing the last of the ice-matted coat, and she had not yet reached the ears. The left ear in particular had been pressed flat against the foal's head since she brought it inside. She smoothed it now, gently, and found beneath the white hair a mark she had not expected. Not an injury, not a brand, a birthmark, a small, dark geometric shape, angular and precise, high on the inside of the left ear, a pattern she had seen before, in a different context, documented in the breeding records her husband had kept with meticulous care for the last decade of his life. Her hands went very still. Douglas had tracked that genetic marker for years. It appeared in only one bloodline, the descendants of a stallion he had acquired as a young man and built his entire breeding program around. It was rare enough that he had used it as a signature identification for his animals, something no artificial brand could replicate, something that proved lineage beyond any argument. It was Conductor's mark, the mark of Conductor's get, which meant this foal was Douglas Calloway's horse, his bloodline, his legacy, and it had been tied to a stake in the snow to die. The foal nudged her hand with its muzzle, a small, deliberate pressure, and Maeva Calloway, who had not cried in front of anyone in 2 years, put her face in her hands and wept quietly in her kitchen while the storm screamed itself out against the windows above her. She named him Ghost before the sun came up. It seemed accurate. She did not sleep. By 7 in the morning the storm had broken, the way Montana storms sometimes do, with an abruptness that made it hard to believe in their reality. The wind simply stopping, the sky clearing to a high thin blue, the sun appearing over the eastern ridgeline and turning the snow into something so bright it was painful to look at directly. Timber Creek lay buried under 22 inches of new accumulation. The road to the ranch was completely impassable. Maeva's world contracted to a few hundred yards of white silence. She had moved Ghost into the smaller of the 2 ground floor rooms, a mudroom that connected the kitchen to the side porch, large enough for the foal to stand if he could manage it and warm enough with a space heater running in the corner. She had fashioned a padded floor from folded horse blankets and her own spare bedding. She had rigged a feeding schedule every 2 hours. She had done all of this running on no sleep and the specific, wired energy of someone with a purpose too urgent to allow for rest. Ghost was standing by 8 o'clock, tentatively, wobbling, his legs arranged beneath him with the uncertain geometry of a newborn, but standing. He pressed his nose against the mudroom door when she opened it, then stepped back carefully and watched her with those pale blue eyes, tracking her movements with an attention that felt almost canine. That quality of absolute orientation toward a specific human that takes most horses considerably longer to develop. She was heating water on the stove when she heard the truck. She heard it before she saw it. The particular grind of heavy tires through deep snow, an engine working harder than it wanted to. She went to the kitchen window and watched the county sheriff's truck navigate the final curve of the ranch drive, throwing white plumes from its tires, and park 30 feet from the back porch. Garth Plunkett got out alone. He was a thick-shouldered man of 60, built in the way that certain men who have held authority a long time are built, not precisely fat, not precisely muscular, but dense, self-contained, occupying space with a kind of physical authority that substituted for other things. He wore his uniform coat with the brass buttons done up correctly, all of them, even on a morning after a blizzard when no one would have noticed or cared. He had a way of holding his face in neutral that Maeva had come to understand, over 2 years of watching him, was not calm so much as calculation. He knocked on the back door. She let him wait a moment, then opened it. He told her he had seen smoke from her chimney on his drive past and wanted to make sure she had come through the storm all right. His voice was warm, concerned, the voice of a public servant genuinely attentive to the welfare of a vulnerable community member. She told him she was fine. He asked if he could come in for a moment, warm up. She stepped aside. He came through the kitchen, accepted the coffee she poured without being asked, and stood with it in both hands the way people do when they want to appear casual and are not. He talked about the storm. He talked about down lines on the county road and a family on the east side of town who'd had part of their roof come in, and whether Maeva had experienced any structural damage. Then he walked to the mudroom door. She had not closed it fully. She watched his face when he looked through the gap and registered the white Foal standing inside on its blanket bed, its pale eyes blinking in the light from the space heater. The color left his face as completely as if someone had drained it. It was not surprise exactly. Surprise has an open quality, a momentary widening before the mind catches up. What crossed Garth Plunkett's face when he saw a ghost was something different, something that collapsed inward rather than opening outward, a recognition immediately followed by the hard mechanical effort of suppressing it. He turned back to Maeva. His voice had changed. He said the foal was property of Heller Stables, a large commercial breeding operation 40 miles north, a business that Maeva knew had expanded dramatically in the last 2 years, seemingly from nowhere, seemingly flush with funds that no one had publicly accounted for. He said she had committed a crime by removing the animal from its location. He said he was going to need to transport it immediately and that he would be in contact with the county attorney about the matter. Maeva listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she asked him how he knew which specific property the foal had come from when she hadn't told him where she found it or what condition it was in when she found it. He said it was a distinctive animal, that the description fit the one that had been reported missing from Heller. She asked him when it had been reported missing. He said that was administrative information he wasn't at liberty to discuss. She asked him if he had a court order authorizing seizure. He said he was the law in this county, and that ought to be sufficient. She asked him to leave. He told her she didn't want to make this into something it didn't need to be. She went to the front room and came back with the shotgun Douglas had kept on the rack above the mantel, a 12-gauge pump action, old enough to have a few dents in the receiver, but maintained with the scrupulous care that Douglas applied to everything he valued. She did not raise it. She held it at her side, barrel toward the floor, and looked at Garth Plunkett with a steadiness that she had not felt in 2 years, a steadiness that came, she realized distantly, from the clarity of knowing precisely what she was protecting and precisely what she was prepared to do. She told him, quietly, that if he came onto her property again without a signed court order from a judge whose authority she could verify, she would exercise her full rights under Montana law. He left, but the way he left, not angry, not flustered, just very still and very deliberate as he walked back through her kitchen and out the back door without another word, told her something she had not fully understood until that moment. He was not surprised. He had not come to check on her welfare. He had come to see if Ghost was dead. He had come to make sure. And now he knew it wasn't. Maeva stood at the kitchen window and watched his truck disappear down the ranch drive, and she thought about the knot. The Callaway hitch. The knot only Douglas knew. The knot on the rope that had tied her husband's bloodline to a stake in the snow. She thought about Conductor, whose body had never been found. And for the first time in 2 years, her grief shifted. Not gone. It was never going to be gone, but moved aside by something colder and sharper and considerably more focused. The snow melted enough in the first week to make the road passable, and then the world Maeva had known was replaced by a subtly different one. The same town, the same faces, the same storefronts along Timber Creek's 4-block Main Street, but arranged now in a new configuration she had not been consulted about. Garth had been busy. She discovered this gradually, in the way you discover a slow leak, not all at once, but through the accumulation of small signs. The feed store clerk who had always nodded when she came in and sometimes told her the news about cattle prices now found something urgent to do in the back stockroom when she arrived. The woman at the grocery store checkout, someone Maeva had known since they were both 30 and Douglas was still alive and life was not yet organized around his absence, looked at her with an expression caught between pity and something else, something that required careful control to suppress. She heard the words in the diner before she heard them anywhere else. She had gone in for coffee on a Tuesday, something she did twice a month, and the conversation at the counter stopped when the door opened and restarted only after she had sat down, and not at the same volume. 2 booths behind her, someone said grief did things to people that you wouldn't expect. Someone else said something about an animal. Someone said the word delusional in a voice pitched just low enough to seem accidental. She drank her coffee. She tipped 30%. She walked out into the February cold with her back straight. At home, she built Ghost's world. He was growing at a rate that startled her. Within a week, he was navigating the mudroom with a confidence that had nothing to do with tentative foalhood and everything to do with his own nature. Purposeful, alert, already displaying the assertive intelligence that Douglas had always said was the mark of conductor's best offspring. By the end of the second week, he had graduated to the interior of the barn, which Maeva had thoroughly insulated and where she spent 3 to 4 hours daily in his company. He learned her habits before she expected him to. He knew the sound of her boots on the porch. He knew which time of morning she brought the warm feed mixture and which time she came only to check the temperature. He knew, and she could not explain this entirely rationally, when her mood was different. When she came to the barn carrying something heavy that had nothing to do with feed buckets, he would press his head against her shoulder and stand very still, and she would rest her cheek against his neck, and neither of them would move for a while. The isolation was the hardest part. She had, without fully realizing it, grown accustomed over the past 2 years to a certain minimum of human contact. The grocery store, the feed store, the diner twice a month, that now evaporated almost entirely. Merchants who had previously been brusque but functional began finding reasons to be closed when she arrived or out of whatever she specifically needed. The woman who delivered mail to the rural routes began leaving Maeva's at the end of the box with a haste that had not been there before. Once, a truck she recognized as belonging to the Heller Ranch slowed as it passed her property line. Didn't stop, didn't turn in, just slowed, and the silhouette behind the wheel turned toward the ranch house for a long moment before the truck accelerated on. She started sleeping with the shotgun within arm's reach. She also started writing things down, not in a diary. She was not a diary-keeping person, but in a methodical log, dates and times and observations. Things she remembered from the period around Douglas's death that she had, in those first weeks of shock, failed to note formally. Things she was noticing now. She kept this log in a notebook she hid behind the panel under the bathroom sink, because she was beginning to understand, with a clarity that felt entirely new and not entirely welcome, that there was a difference between knowing something and being able to prove it. She thought about Conductor constantly. She thought about the geographic question of him, where a missing stallion went, in Montana, where every mile of wilderness was mapped and every ranch kept its fences. A horse did not simply evaporate. A horse left tracks, left feed consumption, left physical evidence in every pasture it occupied. A horse worth what Conductor was worth would appear in breeding records, in registry filings, in the financial transactions of anyone who was using him for what he was for. She went online one afternoon and pulled up what public records she could find for Heller Stables. The business had been incorporated 2 years and 3 months ago, 2 months before Douglas died. Its registered address was a post office box in Billings. Its founding capital documents cited an investor of record whose name she did not recognize. But the business had grown explosively in its first year. New facilities, new stock acquisitions, new breeding contracts with ranches across 3 counties. She printed these records. She put them in the notebook behind the bathroom panel. Garth Plunkett appeared twice more in the weeks that followed. Once driving past the ranch in his personal truck, not the official vehicle, not in uniform, moving slowly. Once at the edge of the grocery store parking lot when she came out with a quarter of what she had gone in for, because the store had apparently run out of several items she needed. He did not approach her. He simply stood by his vehicle and watched her load the truck, with the particular quality of watchfulness that is meant to be seen. She watched him back until he looked away first. Ghost, in the barn, heard her return. His welcoming sound, a low, warm nicker, carried clearly through the February afternoon. She stopped at the barn door and listened to it for a moment, and something in her chest settled. Whatever Garth Plunkett thought she had or didn't have, he had miscalculated something fundamental. He had thought that tying the foal to the stake would be an ending. He had not considered that she was the kind of woman who walked into a blizzard with a dying lantern towards something she could not yet identify. He had not considered what she would do once she could. Ghost was 14 weeks old when someone came for him in the night. It was the particular dark that comes before a February moon, absolute and directionless, and Maeva had been asleep for perhaps 3 hours when the sound reached her. Not a sound that registered as conscious alarm, nothing so clear and defined. More a shift in the texture of the night, a change in the quality of the silence that her sleeping mind processed and rejected, and then processed again until she was sitting up in bed with the shotgun already in her hands and no clear memory of reaching for it. Then Ghost's scream ripped through the dark, and she was already moving. She had never heard him make that sound before. He was not a loud animal by temperament, not a screamer. He communicated in the lower registers, nickers and soft wooфs, and the occasional extended sigh that she had come to recognize as contentment. The sound that came from the barn now was something entirely different. It was the sound of an animal that understood it was in danger and was responding not with flight, but with something older and more decisive. She crossed the porch without her coat and hit the barn door at a run. The padlock had been cut. The door swung inward on a frame that had been forced. The bolt splintered, the wood around it showing raw pale streaks in the ambient light. Inside, the single work lamp she kept burning overnight had been knocked from its hook and lay on its side in the corner, throwing crazy shadows across the interior. Ghost was in the center of the space. He was not cowering. He was planted, all 4 feet set wide, ears pinned flat, every muscle in his white body rigid with a focused aggression that looked, in the tilted lantern light, nothing like fear and everything like fury. Around him, the interior of the barn showed the evidence of a brief and vicious struggle. 2 fence panels had been kicked entirely off their hinges. A section of the western wall showed new damage, boards cracked, and one partially pulled free from the inside, as though something very large had tried to use the wall to anchor itself and failed. The door on the far end of the barn, the one that opened to the paddock, was swinging. Whoever had come in had gone out that way. She ran to the paddock door and looked out into the dark. Nothing. The snow showed a single set of tracks, deep-set, wide-strided, the pattern of someone moving very fast. They went to the far fence and then cut left along the tree line toward the county road. She stared at the tracks until she was certain she had their pattern committed to memory, then turned back inside. Ghost came to her immediately. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and pushed his head against her chest with a pressure that made her take a step back, and she stood with her arms around his neck and felt his breathing, fast still, adrenaline loud, but already beginning to slow, and she said nothing, just held him. After a moment, she began to examine the barn methodically. There was blood on the floor. Not much, not the volume that would indicate a serious wound, but visible, dark against the pale boards, in 2 distinct locations. Near the place where the fence panels had come down, and then in a smeared trail leading toward the paddock exit. Ghost had connected with something, possibly a kick, possibly a bite, possibly both. He had the marks of both capacities. She photographed it with her phone from multiple angles, with the timestamp running. She was on her hands and knees examining the second concentration of blood when she felt the cold weight of the metal object beneath her fingers. She almost missed it. It had been kicked or dropped into a gap between 2 floorboards, and only the edge of it was visible. She worked it free with a fingernail. A brass button, large, custom-made, the kind of button that served a purely ceremonial function on a dress uniform. On its face, raised in the casting, the official seal of the Timber Creek County Sheriff's Department, an eagle with spread wings above 2 crossed stars, a detail she recognized because she had looked at it across her own kitchen table a dozen times over the years at civic events and community meetings, when Douglas was alive and the sheriff was someone they occasionally had to dinner. One of the buttons from Garth Plunkett's dress coat, his gala uniform, the one he wore to official events and ceremonies, the one with the full complement of custom brass hardware that was, she knew from a conversation she dimly remembered at a county fair 3 years ago, custom ordered from a maker in Helena, and cost more than a deputy's weekly salary. She stood in the middle of the wrecked barn with the button in her palm and looked at it for a long time. Ghost nudged the back of her shoulder. She did not turn around. She was thinking about something Douglas had said to her once, in the early years of their marriage, during a dispute with a neighbor over water rights that had lasted 2 seasons and eventually resolved in their favor. He had said, "There are 2 kinds of people who make mistakes in the dark. The ones who know they made a mistake, and the ones who believe the dark will cover it. The second kind are the most dangerous, because they keep making the same mistake right up until the moment the light comes on." She closed her fingers around the button. The light was going to come on. She went back to the house and retrieved the notebook from behind the bathroom panel. She added 3 new entries: the date, the description of the attack and Ghost's response, the location and condition of the blood evidence, and a precise description of the button. She photographed the button from 6 angles and emailed the images to an account she had created 2 weeks earlier on a server she paid for in cash at a library in Billings, using a name that was not her own. Then she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought carefully about what came next. She was not going to the local sheriff. That was obvious. She was not going to hide and wait, because waiting had already cost her 2 years and a husband and a community, and whatever version of herself had existed before grief and isolation and deliberate marginalization had done their work. She was going to the one place where the evidence she was accumulating could not be buried by a badge, in front of every person in Timber Creek at the same time, in a location where there was no escape and no private management of the narrative. She picked up her phone. She found the number she needed. She dialed. When the call connected, she said, "I need to speak with someone in the State Criminal Investigations Division. I have physical evidence of a murder and a cover-up, and I have reason to believe the person responsible is currently the serving sheriff of this county. I need this conversation to stay above the county level." There was a pause. Then, "Yes, ma'am. What's your name?" She told them. 3 weeks later, the Timber Creek Winter Fair was scheduled on the town calendar, a tradition going back 60 years. Every resident of the county would be there. She began to plan. The morning of the fair arrived cold and blue and perfectly clear. Maeva had been awake since 3. Not because she could not sleep. She had slept deeply, the sleep of someone who has made a decision and committed to it fully, but because Ghost needed to be ready. She had spent 2 hours in the barn, brushing his coat until it held the light like something polished, checking his feet, checking his breathing, talking to him in the low continuous murmur that had become their language in the months since she carried him through a blizzard and laid him on her kitchen floor. He was not the wobbling newborn anymore. At 14 months, Ghost stood 15 hands, already larger than most foals his age, carrying in his frame the unmistakable structure of conductor's bloodline, the long-backed athletic build, the deep chest, the neck set with the arched carriage that made thoroughbred people stop and look twice. He was entirely white. In the March sunshine, he did not look like a horse so much as a declaration, something composed specifically to be impossible to ignore. She loaded the notebook, the button in a sealed plastic bag, the photographs printed at the Billings Library, and 2 years of property and financial records into a saddlebag she wore over her shoulder. She put on the black coat, the morning coat she had worn for 2 years, the one the town had come to associate with her isolation and her loss, and she changed her mind and hung it back on the hook. She put on instead a coat of deep charcoal gray that Douglas had given her on their 25th anniversary, a fine wool coat she had not worn since his funeral. She led Ghost out of the barn and into the morning. They walked. The ranch to Timber Creek was 4 miles on the county road. She had considered the truck and rejected it. Arriving by truck was a private act. Arriving on foot, with Ghost beside her on a lead, was a public one. She wanted to be visible for every one of those 4 miles. She wanted the cars that passed her on the road to slow down and stare. She wanted the story of what they saw to arrive in town before she did. Several did slow. One stopped entirely. A rancher she half knew from the far north of the county. A man named Decker who had been decent to Douglas in his lifetime and had looked at Maeva in the grocery store twice in the past year with an expression she had read as guilt. He rolled his window down and looked at Ghost for a long moment. He said, "That is one hell of an animal, Mrs. Calloway." She said, "Yes, he is." He said, "You going to the fair?" She said, "I am." He drove on. She watched him. He did not accelerate all the way to the speed limit. The fair occupied the town square and 3 adjacent blocks, the way it always had, with the canvas-topped stalls and the smell of fried food and the particular noise of Timber Creek's idea of civic celebration, loud enough to feel festive, quiet enough that you could still hear individual conversations. The crowd was substantial. Every family from every ranch and every house in the county's reach came to the winter fair. It was the kind of event where absence was noticed. Maeva arrived from the south end of the main street and walked north. The first person who saw Ghost stopped mid-sentence in whatever they were saying and simply stared. Then the person next to them turned to see what they were staring at. It moved through the fair crowd the way silence moves, not loud, but spreading, person to person to person, until the noise level of the entire block had measurably reduced and dozens of faces had turned in her direction. Ghost moved beside her without the lead entirely taut. He was not spooked by the crowd. He walked with his head up and his ears forward, interested, alert, occupying his own space with the calm authority of an animal that had survived something and knew it. She saw Garth Plunkett before he saw her. He was near the center stall, in his dress uniform, the one with the brass buttons, talking to 2 of his deputies and the owner of the hardware store. His back was partially to her. She watched him register the change in the crowd the way a predator registers a change in the weather, not consciously at first, but in the body, something tightening, something recalibrating. Then he turned. She watched him see Ghost. The hardware store owner said something to him. He did not respond. He was looking at the foal that should have been frozen solid in her backyard 14 months ago, the foal that was now standing in the middle of Timber Creek's annual fair, 15 hands of impossible white horse, alive and calm, and carrying in the geometry of his ears the genetic mark that Garth Plunkett had every reason to want erased from the world. Mabel walked to the platform at the north end of the square. The platform was set up every year for the fair's civic announcements and the school choir and the mayor's brief address. She stepped onto it without asking anyone's permission. The mayor, a small, concerned-looking man named Peter who had been politely useless throughout the entirety of the last 2 years, said something to her from the ground level. She did not hear it. She faced the crowd. She did not use a microphone. She had a voice, Douglas had always said, that carried, and she let it carry now. She said she had something to show them that she wanted every person in Timber Creek to see. She held Ghost's lead. He stood beside her on the ground below the platform, visible from everywhere in the square. She said, "This animal is a son of Conductor, Douglas Calloway's champion stallion, the horse that supposedly vanished the day my husband died." She paused. For those of you who were told that I was delusional on the subject of that horse, that grief had clouded my thinking, I'd ask you to look at the genetic marker on his left ear and then look at the breeding records that I'm going to tell you how to access through the state livestock registry. People were very still. She said, "This foal was tied to a stake on my property in the coldest night this county has seen in 100 years. He was left to die. The rope used to tie him belonged to my family. The knot was one my husband taught me, one that no one else uses." She let that settle. And the morning after I rescued this animal from freezing, the county sheriff arrived at my ranch uninvited, panicked when he saw the foal was alive, and attempted to seize him without a court order. From somewhere in the crowd, a murmur. She did not lose the thread. She reached into the saddlebag and took out the sealed bag with the button. She held it up. Then she looked directly at Garth Plunkett across the square. She said, 14 months ago, someone broke into my barn. Ghost, my horse, defended himself. Whoever came fought with him, was wounded, and left in a hurry. They left something behind in the boards of my barn floor." She walked to the edge of the platform and placed the bag on the ground in front of him. She said, "That is a button from a Timber Creek Sheriff's Department dress uniform. It was in my barn the night someone tried to take or kill my horse. It has been submitted to the State Criminal Investigations Division along with blood samples taken from my barn floor." The crowd was silent in a way that had its own texture. She said the rest quietly, but clearly enough that even the people at the far edges of the square could follow it. She said that the state CID had obtained financial records over the past 3 weeks showing systematic misappropriation of county emergency funds, initiated 4 months before Douglas Calloway's death and continuing for 18 months afterward, totaling in excess of $400,000 in redirected public money. She said the misappropriated funds had been invested in a private horse breeding facility registered under a third-party name, but benefiting a single primary operator. She said Conductor had not died in the storm. He had been found by Garth Plunkett, recognized for his value, and moved to that facility. She said Douglas Calloway had discovered the fund misappropriation. She said Douglas Calloway had not died of hypothermia. The silence that followed was total. Garth Plunkett moved. He did not move toward the platform. He moved for the edge of the crowd, the particular, too casual movement of a man trying to achieve distance before anyone can name what he's doing. His right hand went toward his sidearm, not drawing, just resting near it, a reflex or a threat or both. Ghost saw him move. The foal stepped forward, not explosively, not in the panic-driven scramble of a frightened animal. Deliberately, each step placed with the precision of an animal that had measured the situation and concluded it was capable of handling it. He positioned himself between Garth Plunkett and the edge of the crowd, and he stopped, and he let out a sound that was not a scream and not a whicker. It was something lower and more final, a sound that seemed to carry Douglas's bloodline in its frequency, something that came from a lineage of horses bred to be magnificent and unafraid. Garth Plunkett stopped. He stood in the middle of Timber Creek's winter fair with Ghost blocking his exit and 2 years of suppressed guilt pressing down on him from every direction. And something gave way in his face that Maeva had never seen give way in any person's face before. Not guilt exactly, not fear exactly, but the particular collapse that comes when every mechanism you have used to keep truth at arm's length fails simultaneously. He sat down in the snow. He put his face in his hands. The confession came out of him in pieces, broken and incoherent at first, and then more structured as the weight of it found its own momentum. He said Douglas had come to him with documents. He said he had panicked. He said the storm had provided a window he had not planned but had used. He said the horse. He said the horse. He said the horse. As though conductor were the detail he could not get past, the evidence he had spent 2 years trying to make disappear and had failed to, because an animal trained by Douglas Calloway had chosen a February blizzard to find its way home to give birth, and a woman trained by grief and fury and 2 years of being told she was wrong had chosen to walk into that blizzard and bring the result inside. The sound that moved through the crowd was something no reporter or official account would later adequately capture. At the far end of the square, 3 vehicles arrived simultaneously, state trooper units, blue and white, sirens not screaming but running, a deliberate announcement rather than an emergency response. They had been parked 2 blocks away for the last hour, waiting for the call that Maeva had arranged before she ever set foot on the platform. The deputies who had been standing with Garth Plunkett did not move to stop what happened next. They stood and watched their employer be handcuffed by state officers who had not shaken his hand a single time, and they wore the expressions of people who had privately known something for a long time and were only now, in the cold morning of its exposure, confronting what that knowledge had made them complicit in. Garth Plunkett was escorted to a state vehicle. The crowd watched in complete silence. Ghost watched too, from beside the platform, his pale blue eyes steady, his white coat catching the March sunlight, his ears still forward and alert. Maeva stood on the platform. She did not cry. She had been crying in private for 2 years. She was done with that particular expression of grief, and what she felt now was not grief at all, but something more spacious. A clearing, like the sky after a Montana storm, that had been there all along beneath the clouds and the violence and the long white dark. She looked out at the faces of her town, at the people who had called her delusional and avoided her eyes in the grocery store, and sent their children to cross the street when they saw her walking. She did not say anything to them. She didn't need to. What she had just done said everything. The state troopers spent 11 hours in Timber Creek that day. They processed the square as a confession site, took statements from 37 witnesses, and coordinated with county records to begin the formal seizure of the Heller Stables property north of town. Conductor was found in the 3rd paddock of the facility, in good condition, 10 hands heavier than he had been 2 years ago, still carrying his papers and his registry number on a tag that Garth Plunkett had never gotten around to changing, because changing it would have required a paper trail. The coroner's original ruling on Douglas Calloway's death was formally reopened within a week. The subsequent investigation, conducted by the state medical examiner's office, took 40 days and produced a finding that overturned the hypothesis of accident entirely. Douglas Calloway had not died of hypothermia in the conventional sense. He had been struck from behind, in a location inconsistent with a fall, and left in conditions specifically calculated to ensure the strike's consequence. The manner of death was reclassified as homicide. Garth Plunkett was charged on 14 counts, including first-degree murder, embezzlement of public funds, animal theft, felony breaking and entering, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and 4 additional charges related to the attempt on Ghost's life. He entered a not guilty plea that his own attorney appeared to believe in very modestly. Timber Creek did not know what to do with itself for about a week. The people who had participated in Maeva's marginalization did not all respond the same way. Some came to her directly, within days, showed up at the ranch with their hats in their hands and their voices low, and said things that attempted to explain 2 years of absence and collective willful blindness. Maeva listened to each of them in full, because she was that kind of person, and she neither forgave them easily nor refused to hear them at all. That was not grace exactly, she thought. It was something more pragmatic. She was going to have to live near these people. She intended to do it with her face forward. Others took longer. A few of the merchants who had refused her service sent written notes, formal and awkward in the way of people who were genuinely ashamed of themselves and did not know how to inhabit that feeling with any dignity. She accepted these 2. She put them in the drawer Douglas had used for correspondence, because it felt like the right place. The mayor held a public meeting and formally declared that the county would commission an official portrait of Douglas Calloway for the town hall. He delivered this announcement with the solemnity of someone trying very hard to transform procedural gesture into something adequate to the scale of what it was responding to. It was not adequate, but it was something, and Maeva did not expect anything to be entirely adequate, because some things simply were not. Conductor was returned to the ranch with the same level of official attention that had been used to seize him, which is to say a great deal of paperwork and a state veterinarian certification and 2 officers from the livestock division who seemed genuinely moved by the reunion. Maeva led him into the paddock adjacent to Ghost's and watched the 2 animals approach the fence between them. The old stallion, coal-black and massive, and the young one, white and luminous, and touched noses through the rails with a recognition that had no rational explanation and needed none. She went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched them for a long time. Spring came to Montana with the particular violence of a season that has been held back too long. The snowpack on the Beartooth Peaks melted in 2 weeks in April, sending cold, clear water down every creek and gully in the county, turning the low pastures briefly into marshes before the ground absorbed what it could, and the rest ran south toward the Yellowstone. The ranch grass, when it finally appeared, came in thick and almost disturbingly green, the color of things that have been waiting underground for their moment. Maeva rebuilt the fence line on the north side of the property in early May with help. This was the strangest part, in some ways, stranger than the arrest, stranger than the inquest, stranger than the headlines that appeared briefly in the state papers and then were replaced by other headlines, as headlines always are. The help that came was not the organized community outpouring of a town that had decided on a redemptive narrative. It was quieter than that, and more genuine. Decker, the rancher from the North County who had stopped on the road the morning of the fair, showed up on a Saturday morning with a post driver in his truck bed and spent 8 hours in the sun without being asked. 2 women from the church choir, women Maeva had not spoken to in over a year, appeared one afternoon with enough food to occupy a freezer for a month, said almost nothing, and drove away. A boy of about 16 who had delivered feed to the ranch occasionally in the years before Douglas died came by and asked if there was anything that needed doing. She put him to work repainting the barn. The trial was conducted in a different county, as protocols required. It ran for 3 weeks in September. Maeva testified for 4 hours across 2 sessions. She answered every question directly, without elaboration or embellishment, in the same steady voice she had used on the platform in March. She did not look at Garth Plunkett during her testimony. She was not performing indifference. It was simply that she had nothing she wanted from him anymore. She had wanted the truth, and the truth had arrived. He was convicted on 11 of the 14 counts. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, and Maeva attended it, and she listened to the victim impact statements read by the county's finance officer and the family of a deputy who had quietly suspected something for years and felt the guilt of his own inaction. And then the judge imposed a term of 22 years without possibility of parole for the primary charges. She drove home from the sentencing hearing through an October evening that was already carrying the first edge of another Montana winter in it. Douglas Calloway's official portrait was unveiled in the town hall in November. A good likeness, oil on canvas, larger than she had expected, showing him in his working clothes rather than anything formal. She had been consulted on this and had specified the working clothes, because he had been most himself in them. She stood in the town hall beside the mayor and the county commissioner and the woman who had chaired the portrait committee, and she looked at her husband's painted face and said thank you, and meant it. The name plaque beneath it read, Douglas Calloway, rancher, husband, community member. His truth outlasted its silence. She had written those words herself, at 3 in the morning on a night in September, sitting at the same kitchen table where she had been sitting the night Ghost's cry came through the storm. She had written 12 different versions. That one was the only one that felt accurate. Ghost, by the following spring, had grown into something that made strangers stop at the fence. He was 2 years old, fully developed, carrying conductor's structure with the added height that sometimes appeared in a generation skip. He was being trained, not for competition, not for sale, not for any purpose except the one that seemed natural to an animal of his temperament, to be ridden across the land his sire had crossed and his blood had always claimed. Maeva rode him for the first time on a morning in April that was clear and cold and absolutely still, with no wind from the peaks and the light on the mountains a particular gold that only existed for about 40 minutes at dawn. He moved beneath her like a decision made firmly and kept. She thought about Douglas. She thought about the February night 2 years and some months ago when she had walked into a blizzard with a dying lantern, following something she could not name. She thought about the knot on the rope and what it had told her before she knew how to hear it. She thought about what it meant that the last thing Douglas had done before he died was discover the truth, and the last thing his bloodline had done before dying was find its way home. Conductor was in the south paddock, moving slowly in the morning warmth, old enough now that the years showed in his gait, but still carrying himself with the particular authority of an animal that has been well made and knows it. Ghost saw him from the trail and called out, a high, clear sound that carried across the valley. Conductor raised his head and answered. Maeva sat on Ghost's back in the April morning, listening to the horses speak to each other across the pasture, and she did not try to name what she felt. Some things were not improved by naming. Some things you only honor by letting them be fully, quietly what they are. The last image of this story is simple. A woman sitting on a porch bench in the late afternoon of a May day, a mug of coffee in both hands, the warmth of the sun on her face, and the particular quiet of a Montana evening settling over the valley. The mountains hold their snow still on the upper elevations, but below the timberline everything is green. In the field in front of the house, a white horse runs. Not runs from anything. Not runs toward anything, except the quality of the air and the width of the space and the particular joy of a body that has arrived at its full capability and found the world large enough to use it in. He runs in long, loose arcs, his white coat catching the late sun, his hoofbeats a rhythm that carries clean across the still air to the porch. Maeva watches him. The snow, she thinks, can cover the deepest lies in the world for a time. It is very good at this. It is patient and comprehensive, and it has no malice. It simply covers, indiscriminately, everything that lies beneath it. The lie and the evidence, and the innocent creature tied to the stake and the body of a man who found out the truth too soon. It covers all of it with the same perfect white silence. But the snow always melts. It melts because warmth exists, and warmth cannot be permanently prevented. It melts because the seasons are not negotiable, and neither is the nature of truth, which is that it is a living thing, and living things find their way to the surface eventually. Sometimes the instrument is a foal born in a storm. Sometimes it is a woman who will not stay in her house when something cries in the dark. Sometimes it is both, together. If this story found something in you, a memory, a recognition, a moment where you thought of someone who deserved better from the world, then let this be the thing that carried it. Truth survives. Not always quickly. Not without cost. Not without the woman in the black coat walking through a blizzard with a dying lantern. But it survives. If you believe that, if somewhere in you, that belief is still intact, hit the like button and leave it there. Subscribe so the next story finds you. And leave your city in the comments, because I want to know where the people who believe in this are sitting tonight. I will be back with another story. Until then, take care of the things that cry in the dark. They are usually worth it.